Wow, Alberta sure has some interesting landscape. Hi students, it's Ms.Boley here. Today we're going to be looking at how we can use our watercolor paints and how we can include our knowledge of Jason Carter's artwork and his personal style and create our own landscapes inspired by Alberta. So by now you're familiar with the materials you need for watercolor: our paint palettes, our watercolor paper, our paints. I am going to be using a variety of different markers and wax crayons, a pencil to draw out our sketch, and some people use masking tape to mask the edges of their watercolor paintings. If you don't have masking tape, that's okay. You can just skip that step. And then you'll use your brushes, the same ones that you've used for your other watercolor projects so far. So first I'll show you how to tape down your watercolor paper. So I just normally tape it to my desk or my table, and then I can't move my painting until I'm done. So basically you just put a long piece of tape along each of the edges of your painting. And again, just skip this step if you do not have masking tape. So we're going to start out by sketching our landscape out, thinking about the foreground, middle ground, and background as we're drawing. If we make sure to include all of these parts, our landscape will have a lot of depth or look more three-dimensional, which is a good thing. So first things first, you'll want to find a reference image. And you'll see mine in the bottom left corner. And you'll want to start by drawing a horizon line. So a horizontal line across your paper. And I'm just drawing what I'm seeing in my reference image. So I'm drawing those rolling hills in the background, and I will draw those grasses in the foreground, as well as the hay bale shapes. And I'm sort of taking some inspiration. I don't want to copy Jason Carter's style, but I am taking some inspiration from the way that he simplifies and abstracts the different shapes in nature. So I'm not going for super detailed and realistic. I'm just going for the basic shapes and kind of outlines of the landscape right now. One note about watercolor paintings and sketching, you'll want to try to sketch lightly because your pencil marks will show through your watercolor paint. So just something to think about. So for this assignment, we want to step back after each stage and take a break, get some feedback maybe from your learning coach, do some changes or refinements if needed. So this is that time you can kind of step back from your work. All right, so another thing I want to talk about is the outlines. So in Jason Carter's artwork, he has these bold outlines around his painted areas. So one way we can do this with watercolor is we can use Sharpie marker before we paint with watercolors. So I will do a quick demo. So if I draw some outlines using a Sharpie marker, we'll see what happens when I paint over it with watercolor. So it does not change the outline when I paint over it with watercolor. So this only works with Sharpie brand markers or other markers that say that they are waterproof. If I try the same thing with one of these Crayola markers, something very different will happen. See, these say washable on them. So if I paint over those, it almost acts as a watercolor. So the lines are turning fuzzy and they're kind of bleeding into the watercolor paint. Okay, so unless you want that effect, make sure you don't use this type of marker to outline. Only Sharpie markers or another type of permanent marker. Another option that you can do if you don't have a Sharpie marker or any other kinds of markers is to use a wax crayon. So wax crayons or oil pastels can give us the same type of bold, vibrant outline. And white crayons, or really any color of crayon, will do the same thing, as you know from the wax resist technique that we tried out. So I'm going to start thinking about how I can use those materials to create outlines and maybe some texture in my own artwork. So I'm going to use the Sharpie marker to do outlining. I'm not going to use the crayon, but I will use oil pastels. And if you only have a marker like this, you can definitely use it for outlining after the watercolor is already dry. So keep that in mind if this is the only type of marker that you have. And also keep in mind other colors besides black can be used. So I have this area in my landscape that has sort of like lighter colored grass. So I'm going to use the white wax crayon to mask this area off a little bit. I'm not going to color the whole thing with wax, but I'm just going to sort of do some textural things with my wax crayon. You can't see it, but once I paint over it, you will be able to. And I'm going to do the same thing in the sky for the clouds. So next I'm going to take my oil pastel and I'm going to do some outlining around some of the areas that I want a darker, bolder outline. And I'm going to also use sort of the side of the oil pastel in order to cover larger areas and create a different type of texture than what my Sharpie marker would be able to create. Alright, so now I'm going in with the Sharpie marker and I'm going to outline some of these hay bales and some other things, and I'm sort of going over top of some of my lines a couple of times because I'm trying to get a variety of different thicknesses of lines. So I'm really thinking back to our lesson from earlier in the year where we were talking about like different types of lines, thickness, thinness. Later you'll see I'll start to do sort of like a bit more scribbly lines to kind of look like the grass in the front part of my landscape. The whole time I'm looking at my reference image, and I'm not, like again I said, I'm not going for super realism, but I am looking at that image and basing my drawing off of that. Go with the scribbly lines I was talking about. And I will go back in with my oil pastel and darken up some areas after this, right now. So at this point it might be a good moment to step back and get some feedback. And then I'm going back in with Sharpie marker and pastel yet again to just make a couple changes. And once I feel happy with my outlines, I'm going to go and begin painting with my watercolors. So as I mentioned before, by now you have used watercolors quite a few times, and so you're probably quite familiar with them. So remember to use water on your palette and then mix the paint into the water to create a wash, because we don't want super thick watercolor paints covering up our nice outlining that we did. So I'm making sure to always add water. And I see in my reference image that there is sort of greenish grass in the front, and then the hills in the very back, in the background, are brownish color. And then in the middle ground, the hills are yellow, and my hay bales are also a yellow color with kind of some brown. So I'm mixing up some washes that will match those colors. And again, I'm going for more of a vibrant color than what's actually in my reference image, just to continue along with that inspiration from Jason Carter and using really bright, bold colors. Although watercolor isn't as bold as acrylic. So here I go. I'm just filling in the areas of I'm kind of like painting within the lines kind of thing and filling in my areas using my watercolor paint. If you ever find that your lines are getting covered up, you can just dry your brush off and suction up some of that water and paint on top of the lines that you want to show through a bit more. So as you can see, I'm using the wet on wet technique to add some darker green to my grass in the foreground. And I also have not been stopping and letting my paints dry in between the different colors that I'm doing. And that is okay because it ends up giving me some kind of cool effects where my paints are bleeding around the black outlines. So if you notice that area where the yellow hay bale paint has kind of combined into the green hilly background, looks really cool. But if you don't want that kind of thing to happen, then just make sure you're allowing your paints to dry when you're painting other areas that are touching the area that has wet paint on it. So as you saw, I was using the wet on wet technique and also the lifting wet technique for the sky to create my clouds. And remember, I did the wax resist as well in the sky. So I've got a lot of really nice texture up there. And now I'm just doing the rolling hills in the background, and I'm gonna be mixing a brown with a little bit of purple to try to I don't know, add some interest, I guess. I do have some, because I haven't let my paint dry, I do have some yellow blending in with those hills. And purple and yellow are across from each other on the color wheel. So if I mix those, it's going to turn kind of a browny color, which is fine because I'm going for that for my hills. So I'm just trying to make a variety of dark and light areas within this hilly area, kind of looking at my reference image, but also kind of just going with the flow. because I'm trying to create some depth as well within that area of my painting. Alright, so I'm painting the house area, and I'm also painting that lighter area where I did the wax resist earlier. Alright, it's a great time to let it dry and get feedback after you've blocked all the areas in with color. When you come back, you're going to notice that the colors have dried and probably look a lot lighter than they did. So I am just mixing some darker washes, kind of even taking some paint directly from my paint palette, and I'm trying to darken up some specific areas with paint. Okay, so one more time, you will allow your painting to dry, and then see if when you come back, if you're happy with the darkness of the paint. And I'm actually going to go back in with either an oil pastel or my Sharpie marker or whatever else it was that I used to sort of outline. And I'm using a white pastel here to just like lighten up some of these areas, and then I'm gonna go over some of the outlines that maybe got a little bit covered up with my Sharpie, or just ones that I wanted to thicken or darken. So really the whole point that I'm trying to get at here is taking time and stepping back from your art piece allows you to notice areas that might need a little bit more attention. So make sure that you're doing that process as you're working on your artwork. Alright, so once you feel happy with what it looks like and you feel like it's interesting, you'll remove the tape and take a photo and upload to the gallery.